What if the girl your class bullied for her cheap shoes turned out to be the only heir of the coldest, richest woman in the country? They mocked her every day, called her invisible, and laughed at her silence. No one cared who she was until a black car pulled up to the school gates. And the woman who stepped out didn't ask for explanations. She demanded justice. What did she say in that classroom? It changed the school forever. The classroom buzzed with whispers and perfectly staged laughter desks covered in designer pencil cases and notebooks that cost more than Ava's entire week of meals. But in the far corner by the window, where the sunlight barely reached, she sat still, silent, invisible, deliberate. Her sweater was clean but threadbare, a shade of gray that once had life, but now blended into everything around her, and her shoes scuffed at the toes, creaked softly every time she shifted. No one noticed. No one ever did. The teacher barely called on her anymore, not because she lacked answers, but because the loud ones took up all the space Ava didn't mind. She preferred the quiet. She liked watching people when they thought no one was watching. And today, like most days, they had no idea she was listening. The girls in front, with long, polished nails and laughter that dripped with venom, leaned toward each other. She always wears the same thing, one said, pretending to yawn. Do you think she even owns a mirror? The other giggled, snapping a photo of Ava's frayed backpack with her phone. I'm gonna post this, caption it, exhibit. Oh, when your grandma shops from the past century. They laughed. Ava didn't. She didn't flinch. She just looked out the window like the clouds were more honest than the people around her. But inside, something cracked. Not loud, just enough. Because she'd learned how to carry pain so quietly it made no sound. What they didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, was that Ava came from a name that made empires flinch. A name buried behind decades of secrets and silence, a name she'd never spoken out loud. But the moment was coming, not because she wanted revenge, but because she was done pretending she didn't belong. It happened during fourth period, the kind of day when even the air inside the classroom felt too heavy, too smug, too full of the assumption that cruelty was just part of growing up. The teacher had split them into groups for a presentation to some dull assignment on economic theory that no one cared about except Ava, who had spent her evening researching while others copied paragraphs from AI and Spark Notes. She was placed with Harper and Lila, the queens of the hallway, the kind of girls who didn't need to say they were important because their perfume, their hair, and their parents' bank accounts said it for them. When Ava approached their desk, Harper didn't even look up. Sit there, she said, pointing to the far edge like Ava was a coat. Someone didn't want on their side of the bench, Lila snorted. Just read what we wrote quietly. And please try not to sound like you're applying for a library card. When it was their turn to present, Harper and Lila sauntered up like they were on a runway, tossing their hair, holding cue cards like props. Ava followed behind, holding the notes she'd written by handline neat folded 3 times to fit in her old pencil case. The class looked up. The moment she opened her mouth to speak, Lila whispered, loud enough, "Wait, are those her shoes? They're falling apart." The snickering started at the back, then spread like a cold wind through the room. Someone angled their phone, capturing her, zooming in on her worn soles, the way her voice quivered slightly as she kept reading. The relationship between inflation and labor value. She didn't stop. She never did. But her hands were trembling. When the group sat back down, Harper gave her a fake smile. "Next time, maybe dress like you want to be here." The teacher said nothing. No one did. Ava returned to her seat by the window, the heat in her face burning so hot it felt like shame might peel her skin off. During lunch, the video was already circulating, silent, edited, overlaid with emojis and captions. POV, when your grandma picks your shoes. Ava stood in line for a tray she could barely afford, listening to the sound of her humiliation bounce off every laugh, every tap of a phone screen. She didn't cry, not yet. She just kept standing. But something inside her shifted. She was tired, not just of the laughter, but of the silence that followed, and far away in a mansion surrounded by iron gates and fear. A woman received a message from an assistant she hadn't spoken to in months. It said, "Only this, Ava Grayson has been targeted." Again. "There's a video." The assistant hesitated before adding the last line. "She's still using her mother's name." The woman's fingers froze above her desk. Then she reached for a locked drawer, opened it and pulled out a photo, a little girl in a yellow dress. Ava. Her lips tightened. She called me once. She whispered she didn't speak, but I knew her voice turned cold. Find out what school. Now. It was supposed to be just another lunch break, another day of keeping her head down, letting the storm pass without drawing attention. But today something cracked in a way that couldn't be taped back together. Ava sat alone under the oak tree near the edge of the courtyard, the tray of food untouched beside her. Her phone in her lap lit up with 1,000 versions of the same cruelty screenshots of her shoes, her hair. Her silence turned into entertainment. They had slowed down, her voice pitched it higher, and turned her into a meme. Mismatched and mute was the caption. Ava stared at it, her fingers hovering just above the screen, heart pounding, not with embarrassment anymore, but with something else, something hot, something old. She heard footsteps, quick, familiar. Lila and 2 others strutted by, one sipping iced coffee, the other holding her phone out like a mirror of superiority. Oh my God, you guys, she's still wearing those shoes. Lila laughed, pretending to gag. Honestly, if I got dragged like that, I'd transfer schools. Ava didn't respond. Not with words, not even with a look. She simply stood, picked up her tray, and walked past them without blinking. But once inside the building, she didn't go back to class. She went to the far end of the hall where her locker stood like a monument to everything she didn't have. She opened it, slowly, hands shaking, reached in, and took out the envelope, creased unmarked, kept hidden behind textbooks no one cared about. Inside, it was a card, just a name, a number, no title, no explanation. She had been given it years ago, slipped into her backpack one night after an argument with her mother. The kind of silence that ended relationships. She was told never to use it unless it was serious. Unless it was unbearable. Her thumb hovered, and then she called. The ring lasted exactly 1.5 seconds before the voice answered, sharp low, unmistakably cold. Speak. Ava didn't have the strength for a full sentence. She only whispered 2 words. They laughed. Silence. Then calmly, precisely, the voice replied. What school? Ava gave the name. Her voice broke on the last syllable. The call ended without a goodbye. And miles away inside a glass fortress overlooking the skyline, Victoria Grayson stood from her desk for the first time in days. She didn't shout. She didn't ask questions. She pressed a button on her intercom. Get the car. We're going to my granddaughter's school. Now. And as she walked toward the elevator, her assistant followed with a folder tucked beneath her arm, labeled in gold letters. Ava Grayson. Unauthorized public exposure. The folder had been updated 10 times. This was the last. The classroom lights buzzed faintly as the principal whispered into his earpiece, pale and visibly trembling, and outside, the wind shifted. Ava had returned to class without saying a word. Her phone was off her face, still her voice silent as ever. But something about her presence felt heavier now, like the air itself knew that something was coming. At 12:16 p.m., the gates of St. Viramont Academy, once known for keeping paparazzi out and legacies inopened, not to applause but to dread. The car that pulled in wasn't ostentatious, but there was something about the matte black vehicle and the silent glide of its engine that made every security guard reach for their radios. 4 men stepped out first, coats comms, nothing flashy, but then came the click of heels, rhythmic, measured, ruthless. Victoria. Grayson didn't need to announce her arrival. Her reputation walked 2 steps ahead of her. Her tailored coat cut through the wind like a blade, her eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, her silver hair twisted back into the kind of knot that could slice glass. She didn't greet the receptionist. She didn't sign in. The doors opened because people moved, and the silence that followed her footsteps screamed louder than any siren. The headmistress met her at the end of the hallway, lips pursed in a nervous attempt at grace. Ms. Grayson, what an unexpected visit. Victoria didn't shake hands. She didn't blink. Take me to her classroom. May I ask the purpose? You may not. The headmistress swallowed hard and gestured for the hallway to clear. And in room 207, Ava sat in the second to last row, her hands folded over her notebook, her eyes steady. Though her chest felt like it held a thunderstorm. She had not spoken since lunch. She had not cried. But everyone noticed. The same girls who had mocked her were quieter now, uncertain. Harper glanced at Lila, who was already refreshing her social media with one nervous hand. And then the door opened, The teacher paused mid-sentence, the chalk in his hand squealing off the board. Every student turned, no one breathed. Victoria stepped inside. Alone, her coat, barely shifting, her presence consuming every corner of the room. Her gaze moved once across the students before settling on Ava. "Come here." The words weren't cold, they were final. Ava stood slowly, her shoes making soft sounds on the tile, the sound that had once made people laugh, now echoing like a warning. She walked to the front of the class, stood beside the woman who had not seen her in years, and said nothing. Victoria turned to the class. "Raise your hand if you laughed at her." No one moved. "Interesting," she said, stepping forward. "Because I saw your faces in the video. Some of you laughed, some of you filmed, some of you just watched. And I'm not sure which is worse." A hand twitched, someone exhaled. Victoria ignored them. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small black folder, tossed it on the teacher's desk, where it landed with a soft thud. "I own 43% of the funding that keeps this school in operation. That number will be 0 by tomorrow if my granddaughter is ever humiliated here again. But today is not about funding. Today is about clarity." She turned to the teacher. "You allowed this. I hope your pension isn't tied to tenure." The teacher paled, said nothing. Then she faced the class again. "I want each of you who posted, commented, laughed, or stood by to understand something very clearly. My granddaughter was raised without my name, without my wealth, and still she carries herself with more dignity than most of you will in a lifetime." Harper tried to speak. "Ms. Grayson, we didn't mean." "You did," Victoria said flatly. "And now you'll apologize. Not for her forgiveness, that's hers to give. You'll apologize because your dignity demands it. Or you'll learn what it means to live without any." The students looked at Ava. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Then one by one, hands lowered, heads bowed, and Harper voice cracking pride, broken said, softly, "I'm sorry. It wasn't loud, but it was enough." And when it was over, Victoria placed a hand gently on Ava's shoulder, leaned close, and whispered, "You shouldn't have needed me to do this, but I will never let you stand alone again." Ava blinked, not from shock, but from something else, from the weight of years that had suddenly started to lift, and the girl they thought was nobody had just become the lesson they'd never forget. The entire school seemed to hold its breath as Ava stood silently beside the woman who until now had only existed in headlines and whispered warnings, the one who bought companies by lunchtime and dismantled reputations before dinner. But here in this moment, Victoria Grayson wasn't a tycoon or a storm in human form. She was a wall behind Ava, unmoving, unyielding, and terrifyingly exact. The silence stretched like a wire. No one in the classroom dared to speak, not the girls who had laughed, not the teacher who now looked like he wanted to disappear into the chalkboard, not even the administrator who had rushed in, only to freeze when Victoria's gaze flicked toward her. Ava could feel all of it, the attention, the weight, the shame that was no longer hers, but she didn't shrink from it. She stood taller, not because she had anything to prove, but because she finally didn't have to apologize for existing. Victoria turned to the teacher, one last time. "Clear the room." The man blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Excuse me. You failed to create an environment where learning is safe, so now I'll teach the lesson." And without raising her voice, without offering justification, she looked at the students and said, "Leave." They stood stunned, grabbing backpacks and water bottles and exiting, slowly glancing back at Ava like they were seeing her for the first time. Not as the quiet girl, but as someone who had been holding back a bloodline that could break them with a whisper. When the room emptied, Victoria closed the door herself. Ava turned to her, her voice soft, trembling. Not from fear, but from the chaos she'd held in for years. "You really came?" Victoria took off her sunglasses, her eyes sharper than Ava remembered, but also gentler, buried beneath layers of ice that seemed to melt only for her. "Of course I came," she said. "I should never have left you to handle them alone." Ava swallowed. "Mom didn't want you involved. She said your world would destroy mine." Victoria's jaw tightened. "Your mother was wrong. The world destroys girls who try to survive alone. I gave her distance, but that was a mistake. I won't repeat with you." She walked slowly around the classroom, her fingers grazing the edge of a desk, pausing by the chalkboard where Ava's name was still listed under presentation partners, Harper, Lila. Ava. She underlined Ava's name with a piece of chalk turned to her and said, "You don't belong behind them, you belong ahead of them." Ava blinked fast, her fingers twitching. "Why now?" she asked. "Why show up now? After all this time?" Victoria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened her purse, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with time. She handed it to Ava. "You wrote this when you were 8. You never sent it, but I got it anyway." Ava opened the page, her breath catching at the sight of her own handwriting. "Dear Grandma, I know you're rich and busy, but I think I'm invisible at school. Can you teach me how to be seen?" Ava's voice broke on the last line. "I was so stupid." "No," Victoria said, stepping closer. "You were a girl who understood something most adults don't. Visibility isn't about volume, it's about value. And from now on, if anyone tries to question yours, they'll have to answer to me." Ava nodded slowly, emotion swelling in her throat. But this time, it wasn't shame, it was a strength. For the first time, the classroom didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a place where she had just taken root. And outside the door, dozens of students waited silent, phones clutched, unsure what to believe. Because the girl they had overlooked was no longer just a name on a presentation slide. She was the granddaughter of a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to bring the world to its knees. And the era of Ava Grayson had just begun. The news broke before the students even made it home. It started with a single photo. Victoria Grayson standing in front of the classroom chalkboard, her hand resting lightly on Ava's shoulder. The words, "She is mine," scribbled in sharp white across the board behind them, captured by a teacher too stunned to understand the weight of what he'd just immortalized. And then everything spiraled. Ava's name was no longer followed by whispers in the hallway, but headlines on every major platform. Grayson heiress found at Elite Academy, was bullied for months, read one. Victoria's ice heir, the granddaughter. Hidden in plain sight, blared another. And yet Ava said nothing. She didn't post. She didn't speak to the press. She returned to school the next day the same way she always had, quietly with her books clutched to her chest, dressed in clothes that didn't scream for attention. But now, no one could ignore her. Not because she had changed, but because everything around her had. Teachers looked away when she entered the room, unsure if they'd be named next. Students cleared her path in the hallway, unsure if breathing in her direction might bring consequences. Harper, once the loudest now, walked with her head lowered, her friends silent, her arrogance drained. But Ava wasn't looking for retribution. She was looking for accountability, and Victoria wasn't done. She called a board meeting without warning. Within hours, the school's funding model was frozen, re-evaluated, and exposed. Private donations from families who had bought silence over the years were revoked. 3 faculty members were quietly dismissed. A new policy was announced. Every student would now have a seat at the equity committee, and the first name to chair it, Ava Grayson. But then came the third twist. Victoria held a press conference, and to everyone's surprise, she invited Ava to speak. Ava, who had never been on stage. Ava, who had never wanted a spotlight. The cameras flashed as she stepped up to the podium, her voice soft, her presence fragile but undeniable. "I didn't ask for this attention." She began, "I didn't want to be known for my last name. I wanted to be known for what I loved, for what I created, for the kindness I showed when no one was watching. But what I've learned is that power doesn't just sit in boardrooms, it sits in classrooms, in whispers, in laughter that wounds. And if I have to carry a legacy, I'll use it to make sure no one else gets laughed into silence." The room went still, no applause, just respect. And in the silence, Victoria stood behind her, not as a shield, but as a pillar. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Ava had become the fire she had once been protected from. And now the world was finally seeing what Victoria had always known. Her granddaughter didn't inherit power. She earned it, quietly, relentlessly, unforgettably. The offer came quietly slipped across the table, on thick cream paper, with gold trim, the name of a prestigious boarding school, embossed in the corner, and the words, "Full scholarship, all accommodations," written in the kind of polite font that screamed privilege. It was everything most students would kill. For a chance to escape, to start fresh somewhere, where no one knew the shame, the mocking, the pain, but Ava didn't even blink. She pushed the envelope back across the table to Victoria and said without hesitation, I'm not leaving Victoria seated across from her in a suite that overlooked half the city. Narrowed her eyes not out of disapproval, but curiosity. Why, she asked simply, "Because they still think I'm only here because of you." Ava said, "If I leave now they win. They'll say the girl who didn't belong ran away when it got too loud, and I've been silent my whole life." "I'm not giving them the ending they want." Victoria leaned back, folding her hands. "So, what do you want?" Instead, Ava reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper covered in notes, scribbles, and circled names. "I want to start a program here inside this school. Not for me. For the other girls, the ones no one sees, the ones who walk into class with borrowed shoes and quiet dreams and get laughed into corners. I want mentorship, access, protection. I want them to know they don't have to survive it alone." Victoria studied her, the corner of her mouth twitching ever so slightly. "That's a war," she said. "Good," Ava replied. "I'm tired of pretending I wasn't born for one." And just like that, something shifted between them, not just legacy or name or blood, but mutual recognition. Victoria didn't offer a smile, but she nodded once like a general acknowledging a commander. "Then we'll build it," she said. "On your terms." The next day, a new name was announced during morning assembly. The Grayson Initiative, created and led by Ava Grayson, with full support from the board and immediate funding, to begin. The girls who had once laughed now sat in silence, staring at the same girl they had once pushed to the edges, now standing at the center of change. And when asked by a reporter if she forgave the ones who hurt her, Ava answered without bitterness. "Forgiveness isn't the point," she said. "Accountability is." She didn't want revenge. She wanted a system reset. And in choosing to stay, not to run, not to rise above, but to root herself, right where they tried to bury her, Ava didn't just reclaim her name, she turned it into a platform, one built not on wealth, but on resistance, resilience, and the quiet kind of revolution that doesn't knock first. It walks in and stays. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened everywhere, all at once. One by one, students who had once laughed in the shadows began to change, not because they were afraid of power, but because they had seen what grace looked like when it stood in the fire and refused to move. The Grayson Initiative spread faster than anyone expected, first through whispered invitations, then through handwritten notes passed under desks, and finally through open applications that flooded with stories, raw, honest, heartbreaking. Girls wrote about hiding their creativity to fit in, about skipping lunch, to avoid stares, about shrinking themselves so the world wouldn't push harder. And for the first time, Ava wasn't standing alone. She had built a space that didn't just protect the unheard, it amplified them. Students began volunteering, mentoring, and speaking out. One girl who had been mocked for her stutter now led speech workshops. Another who had been bullied for wearing thrifted clothes became the leader of the Sustainable Fashion Club. Ava moved quietly through it all, never demanding the spotlight, never correcting the narrative. She didn't have to. The results spoke for her. Teachers who once ignored her now sought her out for feedback. Journalists requested interviews, most of which she declined, but one clip went viral. Ava, standing at the front of a packed classroom, holding a worn notebook saying, simply, "You don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to refuse to disappear." The comment section exploded. Influencers who had stayed silent during her humiliation now tried to associate with the movement, but Ava never called them out by name. She didn't need to. The students did that for her. And while the internet turned her into a symbol, Ava remained the same. Sitting at the same desk, wearing the same clothes, helping the same people. Only now the silence around her had turned into respect. One afternoon as she walked through the courtyard, a younger girl approached her nervously holding a lunch tray. "Can I sit with you?" she asked. Ava smiled, gestured to the bench beside her. "You never have to ask." The girl sat, and within minutes 2 more joined. It wasn't about popularity, it was about presence. And Ava's presence no longer begged for belonging. It commanded it. Behind the scenes, Victoria watched all of it with a kind of pride she had never known she was capable of. Not because Ava had inherited her name, but because she had transcended it. And in a world obsessed with volume, Ava had reminded everyone that real power doesn't scream. It stands still and makes the world go quiet. By the time the school year ended, Ava's name had become more than just a headline. It had become a symbol stitched into something deeper, something permanent, something no scandal or spotlight could unravel. She had not rewritten the rules. She had reminded people that the rules were broken to begin with. And unlike the girls who once mocked her, she didn't need to post pictures of her victory. She lived it every day in the spaces she reclaimed. Desks that once turned away from her now leaned closer. Voices that once whispered behind her now asked for her opinion, and students who had once chosen silence out of fear now spoke with a conviction they had learned just by watching her refuse to leave. A documentary team reached out twice. She declined both times. A fashion label offered her a sponsorship deal to rebrand the modest look. She laughed and said no, because Ava had never asked for attention. She had simply asked to be seen. And once the world finally looked, it was the world that changed. On the final day of school, during a quiet afternoon, she sat beneath the oak tree where she had once eaten lunch alone. The same tree, the same breeze. But this time, she was joined by the new girls, the ones no one talked to, yet the ones still figuring out how to belong. One of them asked, "Is it true your grandmother could buy this whole school?" Ava smiled. "She could," she said, "but she didn't. She let me do something harder. She let me stay." In a televised interview, aired weeks later, a sociologist sat before a national audience and said, "What Ava Grayson represents is a cultural pivot. We are no longer applauding the loudest voice in the room. We are watching the quietest one hold it together." And in the final image of the school's yearbook, Ava stands not in the front, not in the spotlight, but in the middle of a crowd of students who all now sit taller because she did. No caption, no headline, just one handwritten quote beneath the photo in simple ink. "They mocked me because they couldn't imagine who stood behind me. They stopped laughing when they saw who stood beside me, but they only changed when they saw I could stand on my own." And with that, the story didn't end. It echoed quietly, relentlessly, permanently. They didn't know her name, they didn't know her story, and they certainly didn't know who was watching. But when her grandmother showed up, not to save her, but to stand beside her, everything changed, because the quiet girl they laughed at didn't need revenge, she needed a chance. And when she got it, she didn't just rise, she reached back and pulled others up with her. Now, she doesn't walk through those halls alone. She walks with every girl who was ever told she didn't belong. And this time, no one dares to laugh.